Thank you for coming, and I'm excited about tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bring Alfred North Whitehead and his philosophy to life. So we're not going to get a graduate thesis on the particulars of his philosophy, but what I intend to do is give an understanding of who he is as a person, why he's so unusual, and why we're more influenced by him than we might know. Now, many people have not read Whitehead, but we are, most of us are more affected by his ideas and his way of approaching the universe than we would imagine. A lot of what I'm going to be referencing are these two books, but mostly this book, which is, it's a record of dialogues that were conducted at his house at Harvard between 1934 and 1947. And there was a journalist who became close friends with Evelyn and Whitehead. And so I was just saying that we're going to be speaking about Whitehead, and what I intend to do is really open up an understanding of who he is and why he's so significant. Now, this series is supposed to be a series on mystics. Now, Whitehead is known as a mathematician and a philosopher, which is, mathematicians and philosophers are not generally thought of as mystics. Whitehead, in my opinion, really is a mystic. He has a sense of the unknowable nature of the universe, an unknowable nature of what he referred to as God. He comes from a Christian background. His father was a pastor. So he had that sensitivity. He didn't teach religion or preach religion, but he spoke about man's life, and the usefulness of knowledge can be measured by how much it deepens our sense of our humanity, how much it changes us as human beings, how much it cultivates us as human beings, which tends to be a religious or mystical outlook on life. That you're looking at the ineffable and the mysterious nature of the universe as something that will inform our humanity. And so that was really what he taught. Now, what's interesting is that he was a brilliant mathematician and logician, but his philosophy came very much out of his observations of life and his dialogues and conversations. And I'm going to read two quotes of his, because he said that outside of the book knowledge, which is necessary to our professional training, I think I've got most of my development from good conversation, to which I've always had the luck to have access to. And then he said, which is the basis of his conversations, he said, it requires a very unusual mind to undertake the analysis of the obvious. So he would gather people at his house, and he would mix up people from faculty to undergraduates, which in the 30s was unheard of. Harvard was very rigid and kind of uptight class categorization system there. And he would mix people up, and he had different instructions about how to get these conversations going. And he said, you need to get into it gently. So it's fine, for the first 10, 15 minutes to just speak about the weather until everyone gets comfortable, and then you start exploring more challenging and deeper matters. And what you find in this is that he was very open. He was one of the best read and most knowledgeable Americans of the time, when he was originally English, and really I think one of the greatest minds of the time's period. But he wasn't one that held his knowledge over everyone he was with, and he would have conversations with the carriage master and with the different people who would come and go through his house, the journeymen and the students and the faculty. I mean, he really was interested. It's not that he didn't differentiate. He did differentiate, but he had this openness of interest. So he took in views from all these different people, and that helped him approach and see reality in different ways. And that's part of how he related to a philosophical outlook on life, was that one needed to be very open and needed to value different perspectives on reality, rather than trying to come up with a dogmatic assertion of what the nature of truth is. What really influenced him most philosophically was when the certitudes of Newtonian physics got overturned. Now, for us, that doesn't sound earth-shattering, but he was a mathematician, and in his work with Bertrand Russell, he over the course of 3 years, 1910, 1912, and 1913, they co-published these 3 volumes, Principia Mathematica, which was meant to set out constants and mathematical theorems and sequences that should explain all of mathematics. Now, by the time they came to the end of that, he realized that was impossible, and you started to see the constants being overturned by quantum understanding. And what was interesting about Whitehead is, rather than cling to his assertion and belief that you could answer everything, he started to realize that the universe looked differently, and the universe didn't look like set objects that you could define in relationship to other set objects. He started to look at the universe in terms of movement and flow and process and relatedness. So before, you said, okay, if you could just understand well enough, you could actually map how everything related. And after his years of in-depth work, he realized, no, that's not really possible. And part of his own mathematical work did help undermine and weaken the understanding and conviction in some of Newton's work. So he's very humble about that in his work. And what he said about it, he said that when he was talking about how seeing that the universe was not so certain and that you couldn't pin it down, he spoke about how significant that was for his own thinking. He would tend to leave out the fact that his own work was seminal in collapsing that whole worldview that had been believed in for so many years. And what he said, this is in a quote to a Boston journalist, he said, "Whoever dreamed that the ideas and institutions which looked so stable would be so impermanent? Yet since the turn of the century, I've lived to see every one of the basic assumptions of science and mathematics set aside. Why, some of the assumptions which we've seen upset had endured for more than 20 centuries. This experience had profoundly affected my thinking. To have supposed you had certitude once, and then to have it blown up on your hands into inconceivable infinities, has affected everything else in the universe for me." I love that quote because he so embraces the knowledge and view that changes everything in a way that is filled with wonder and humility and awe and a sense of that as far as we can go, and as cultivated as our minds are, whatever conclusions we come to now could be overturned again. And he's able to embrace that as a scholar, as an academic, and as an individual whose word and opinion a lot rests on. He was able to embrace that in a way that gives him stature. He's not weak from it, but he is able to embrace that in a very profound way. And part of that is really also why I feel he is a mystic. He bases his view on a sense of greater truths and a sense of a larger order of things that is a call of a mystic, because he can't know and contain and hold in his hand exactly what the world looks like and where we're going to go with it. And he talks a lot about that, and what he says is he's very learned. He studied. He read Greek as he read all the classic philosophers in Greek as a child. I mean, he read. His apartment was filled with bookcase. His bookcase was actually so full that he had his books lined. Though the shelves were long, so he had them lined too deep, because the apartment couldn't fit everything. So he built long, deeper bookshelves so he could have 2 rows, and he had read everything in there. And he was always giving away books to libraries and whole collections to libraries, so he really knew an extraordinary amount. But when he talks about and advises his students on what's most important, he said, what's wanted is an immense feeling for things, not this mind that acquires facts, but he encouraged his students to feel into things. And he said an enormous part of our mature experience cannot be expressed in words. We need to sort of open ourselves to something beyond what we can even articulate. And for someone as erudite as him to be emphasizing a knowingness that is greater than our intellectual capacities is a very interesting juxtaposition, because if he weren't so learned and if he weren't so bright, then you could say that he's dismissing knowledge, which he's not at all. But he uses knowledge in service of a greater sense of connectivity with the mystery of life, rather than to explain it all and reduce it. So that's I find it very endearing and inspiring, because there are few people who can accomplish so much and be as gracious and humble about it. He said, this is a beautiful quote about his, which really is a real classic of his more mystical side. He said, "Religion is the vision of something which stands beyond, behind, and within the passing flux of immediate things. Something which is real, and yet waiting to be realized. Something which is a remote possibility, and yet the greatest of present facts. Something that gives meaning to all that passes, and yet eludes apprehension. Something whose possession is the final good, and yet is beyond all reach. Something which is the ultimate ideal and the hopeless quest." So, he, of course, lived in times, before the spiritually independent, the spiritual but not religious. There was more secularization in the 30s and 40s, but mostly people at that time identified with some type of church denomination. There's a smaller sects of non-Christians, but in England and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it was basically a Christian environment, and most people identified with church. But the religion that he spoke to and from was this much more open sense of the religiosity of life. part of what made him who he was also the fact that the time that he lived in, he really spanned a tremendous amount of change. Probably the biggest change for us in our time is sort of World War II to the internet, and you can see those two things. But he was born in 1861. So you think about that, that's Civil War times in America. He was in England, but that's Civil War. That was a long time ago. And it was really the late Victorian age in England. And then he lived through World War I in London. He was at Cambridge in England. And then the second period of his life was really during World War I, where he spent time in London, and at that time he was a manager, and everyone was very surprised that he could go from this very esoteric mathematical work that he was doing with Russell to go and assume this managerial post at a university in London. He did very well. He was eminently practical, which was also a big surprise for people. And then the third part of his life was when he was 63, Harvard invited him to come live in Cambridge, Massachusetts and teach philosophy. And he had, as I mentioned earlier, he had never been in a philosophy class in his life. The first philosophy class he was ever in, he taught. And that was at Harvard. And he was at Harvard through World War II and then died just after the war in 1947. When he was young, his father was a pastor, and they weren't well off, but his family life was very happy. It was a warm family. He was well educated, but the emphasis was on morals and ethics and being a good person rather than just book knowledge. And he said that later on, what he said was most important for an individual's development had to do with good company and a sense of morality and the importance of an ethical framework for life. He didn't feel that the type of intense education that he got was required to become a person who is deeply engaged with life. He did go to this school called Shelburne, which was, if you're British, it's very well known. It was founded in 1200, and it's been in school since then. So it was very prestigious and elitist. And as I said, he read the Greeks. He read the New Testament in Greek. He read philosophers in Greek. He loved Wordsworth and Shelley, and he studied Latin. He really spent his time getting abroad what was then a liberal arts education. When he married a woman named Evelyn in 1890, and they were incredibly close, which was also kind of unusual at the time because the spheres were in that day and age were pretty much separate. If you think about 1890, there was a woman's sphere, there was a man's sphere, but those two were real partners. And when you read the dialogues, she played a key role in the salons. She would comment. They had an affectionate and kind of very informal relationship. They would tease each other. She particularly would tease him. And he said about her, her vivid life has taught me that beauty, morals, and aesthetics is the aim of existence. By myself, I'm only one more professor, but with Evelyn, I'm really first rate. And her graciousness and charm is part of what enabled people to feel relaxed in these conversations and what drew out so much from all of these participants that would come to his house. And it's also part of what kept him moving and studying and aspiring in this very human way. I think it's because they had such a close relationship. They had several children. One of his sons died in fighting in World War I, and that was extremely tragic, particularly for him. In some ways, he never really got over it, the loss of his son. It was very difficult for him, and it was part of why he felt in his relationship to World War II, he felt the suffering very deeply, and he wasn't dogmatic and intense about the different positions in the war. I mean, obviously he was against fascism, but he was aware that on all sides there was just tremendous suffering, and he related to it quite personally in a very touching way. And fortunately, he lived to see the end of the war, which was an important thing for him. Everyone knows his name, and people know he has something to do with evolution, but they don't really know what he did. Few people try to read him because, as I said, his philosophical writings are pretty dense. But once you read his conversations, his philosophical writings are a lot easier to read. Once you get to know him a little bit, you can start to make sense of them and feel the person behind them. But even during his lifetime, they were always looking for people who knew and understood what he wrote. And there was one student of his work who ended up at the university, at Chicago Divinity School, and he gave one lecture on Whitehead, and he understood Whitehead's process philosophy so deeply that they immediately gave him tenure. He taught there for 20 years. And the University of Chicago was the place to go to study Whitehead's work because nobody really understood him. And partly it's because his thinking was so porous, and he let so much in, and he took such unusual turns, and yet it all had this very strong basis in logic, and he was very careful in his thinking, that it was a hard juxtaposition to get your brain around. But this fellow who ended up at the Chicago Divinity School said, not many people will read Whitehead's recent book in this generation. This was in 1927, and he was writing about process and reality. Sorry, it was 1929. He was writing a review of Process and Reality, which is one of Whitehead's famous books. He said, not many people will read Whitehead's recent book in this generation. Not many will read it in any generation. But its influence will radiate through concentric circles of popularization until the common man will think and work in the light of it, not knowing whence the light came. After a few decades of discussion and analysis, one will be able to understand it more readily than can be done now. Which I think was prescient, because Process and Reality describes, Whitehead is really credited with founding process philosophy, and that is where he lays out his understanding and view of the world, that the world is in movement, and that the more true perspective on reality is to see a movement of experience and relationship rather than static pieces, and try to define those pieces. He said everything is in motion in relationship to everything else, and as you start to understand that, you realize that there are not only different juxtapositions of things. It's not just you're looking at two things and you're going to look at it from that side or you're going to look at it from this side, but everything is moving in relationship. So if we look at the relatedness as the constant rather than the objects as the constant, we're going to have a different view of reality. And that he's credited with adding the term creativity to the dictionary, which I only learned recently, and that was very much a part of his work. He said that creativity is without a character of its own. It is the universal of universals. And he talked about creativity as this process or flow, and that he also said it's pure feeling or aliveness. And I think my understanding of this is, as he was trying to articulate what creativity is, what this sense of flow and novelty and emergence and recreation was, he was trying to feel into a way to describe his sense of God, his sense of something that is underlying everything, that is the substance of life, that is that essence or nectar that makes life what it is. And so, you know, he said it's pure feeling, it's curiosity, it's alertness, it's aliveness and ardor, but without shape. He talked about it as love. He talked about creativity as this qualityless quality. And that was his more, you know, when he was waxing more lyrical, that was really this creative essence as a sort of mystical understanding was really part of his intimations of what God says. And this is the beautiful passage that he said, God is in the world or nowhere, creating continually in us and around us. This creative principle is everywhere, in animate and so-called inanimate matter, in the ether, water, earth, human hearts. But this creation is a continuing process, and the process is itself the actuality, since no sooner do you arrive than you start on a fresh journey. So there are a couple things about that which I think are interesting to unpack, because, you know, what he says, that the process itself is the actuality, is the essence of his process philosophy. The process itself is the actuality, not the things in motion, not the car that's moving, but the movement itself. And that was just, we have a better sense of that, but we don't really live with that as our way of relating to the world. We really live with the sense of static objects moving from one place to another, and we're aware of motion. But we're not aware of motion as the actuality itself. We really think that we are the actuality and the motion is what we do. And we can see that we're constantly changing. We know that we know a little bit about how biology works. You know, we're constantly shedding cells. Cells are dying. Cells are we know that we're changing, but we don't look at change as the constant, as the essence, in the way that he really did. And I think that what made him so captivating, because everyone who's with him describes how extraordinary it was just to be with him. You felt this lightness of being, and people said that inevitably it happened every time they were with him, that this kind of gentle radiance would take over. And I think it's very much because he wasn't speaking about something theoretically. He was really speaking from this intimation of a different order of understanding and knowing. And what the other part of this quote, where he talks about this creative principle being everywhere or nowhere in animate and so-called inanimate matter. And that's something that I think more and more scientists and also ecologists are starting to look at, that it's not just sentient beings, it's not just human beings that have this sense of process or the sense of consciousness, but you can find these principles all the way down to the most fundamental particles. You're seeing motion, you're seeing relatedness, you're seeing attraction, you're seeing a lot of the things that obviously human beings are much more evolved than, you know, quarks and pi mesons, but a lot of the principles that guide our lives and relatedness biologically and socially are principles that you can see in the field of subatomic particles. And so, is there really separation between animate and so-called inanimate matter? Well, Whitehead in the 30s was already saying, well, I'm not so sure about that. If we're looking at things as this creative unfolding and this movement, then there's nothing separate from that. Now, of course, he didn't confuse human consciousness and sentience with inanimate objects, but his embrace of everything. I think it's also partly his mathematical background. When he looked to create a theory, he was looking to create a theory that encompassed everything, that really addressed everything and was valid everywhere. So yes, he's far out. I mean, when I read him, I can say, oh yes, this makes sense, and I understand that. But he was the first to articulate this. He was really the father of this point of view, and his work is really, he was a precursor of the ecological movement here, of the understanding of the interconnectedness and the interrelationship of all things. And he influenced very much the thinking that, we must look at the world as this vast interconnected web, and we must look at our effects and the effects of our decisions and choices and progress and building as it's affecting the entire ecosystem all around us. And this was something that he talked about and thought about in the 30s and 40s, which was in the middle of World War II, when most people were not really thinking about our effect on the natural world around us. So he's just far out. Now, the other thing that after all of this, he said, after all of his intuiting and understanding of this nature of life as process, he refused to solidify it. And he said that there are no whole truths, all truths are half-truths. It's trying to teach them as whole truths that plays the devil. And there are two interesting things about that. One is his incredible humility, is that he was prepared to be proved wrong, to have anyone come and supersede his knowledge with something that was more true, more inclusive. And also because he had seen with World War I, and particularly World War II, the violence of dogmatism and the violence of an assertion of an absolute truth. I think that just was so much a part of his experience that he was also very aware that we need to always leave room for what we don't know. And then the third aspect of that is I think also very much in process philosophy. You just see things as in motion. So you could never have a whole truth that could capture all of it, because everything is moving. So even your understanding of any particular incident or event would have to be part of this process of motion. So there could only always be something that was a partial truth. Now, he wasn't a relativist. It's not postmodern relativism where there's nothing absolute, where everything is just always in relationship to each other in a way that you can't assign value. He did assign value, and he assigned things in a hierarchy of values, and he felt that knowledge, and as I said before, knowledge and philosophy are supposed to increase our sense of humanity and compassion and empathy and sensitivity. So he worked in a value structure, and yet he still left room for truth and conclusions to be relative. So he's full of these very interesting juxtapositions that you don't usually find in one being. I'm going to read one last quote, and then we can just talk about him a little bit. He said, this is a great quote. He said, "The universe is vast. Nothing is more curious than the self-satisfied dogmatism with which mankind at each period of its history cherishes the delusion of the finality of its existing modes of knowledge. Skeptics and believers are all alike. At this moment, scientists and skeptics are the leading dogmatists. Advance in detail is admitted, fundamental novelty is barred. This dogmatic common sense is the death of philosophical adventure. the universe is vast. So that's him. He was certainly aware of the scientific materialism becoming incredibly dogmatic, which we've only seen more and more of in our day and age. And he always wanted to leave room for, as he said, adventures of ideas. And his personality and his life was really lived in that spirit of discovery and adventure. And it was an adventure that was inclusive, that he really wanted to bring everyone into and accepted everyone as having that innate human curiosity that he tried to bring out. So that is my brief description of Alfred North Whitehead and why I think he's a mystic and why I'm so excited about him.